The operating room stood frozen as every passing second pushed Jimin closer to the edge, yet he refused to let the surgeons begin. His condition was deteriorating, the medical team was running out of options, and the members watched helplessly as fear spread through the hospital corridors. No one could understand why Jimin kept holding on, silently waiting for someone who wasn't there. Far away, Jungkook had no idea that a single decision from his past had led to this heartbreaking moment. As the final chance to save Jimin slipped away, one question echoed through everyone's heart. What promise was powerful enough to make Jimin risk his own life until Jungkook finally arrived? Long before the emergency lights flooded the hospital corridors with a relentless glow, Jimin and Jungkook had built a bond that seemed impossible to break. Their connection had never depended on grand gestures or public displays of affection. Instead, it had grown through countless quiet moments, shared hardships, and an unspoken understanding that each would always be there when the other needed strength the most. To everyone around them, they looked like two people whose trust had been tested many times but had always emerged even stronger. The rest of the members often noticed the balance between them. RM admired how they could calm one another without speaking. Jin frequently joked that they argued like brothers but protected each other like family. Sugar quietly observed that neither of them ever truly walked alone, even during their busiest schedules. J-Hope filled difficult days with optimism, while Taehyung often smiled at the silent loyalty that connected the two in ways words could never fully explain. Together, they formed a family built on years of shared memories, sacrifices, and unwavering support. As their careers demanded more from them, exhaustion slowly became part of everyday life. Endless rehearsals, overseas schedules, sleepless flights, and constant pressure left little room for rest. Jimin continued smiling for everyone, hiding fatigue behind gentle expressions and reassuring those around him that everything was under control. Jungkook did much the same, carrying responsibilities that few people ever realized rested on his shoulders. Whenever one struggled, the other instinctively stepped forward, making their partnership appear almost effortless. Yet beneath those reassuring smiles, tiny cracks had already begun to form. Jimin occasionally disappeared for routine medical examinations that he described as nothing serious. Each time he returned, he brushed away questions with the same calm smile, convincing everyone that the visits were simply precautionary. Even Jungkook accepted those explanations, believing Jimin would never hide anything truly important. That trust, once their greatest strength, slowly became the very thing that concealed an uncomfortable truth. At the same time, Jungkook found himself burdened by an opportunity that promised to secure an important future for everyone. The commitment required absolute focus and long periods away from the group, forcing him to make difficult choices without fully explaining the pressure he carried. He convinced himself that temporary distance would protect those he loved from unnecessary worry, never imagining how deeply his silence would be misunderstood. The distance between them was almost invisible at first. Messages became shorter. Shared meals became less frequent. Late-night conversations that once eased every burden slowly disappeared beneath packed schedules and growing exhaustion. Neither realized they were protecting the other by keeping painful secrets, while unknowingly allowing loneliness to take root. Taehyung sensed the change before anyone else. He noticed the lingering glances across rehearsal rooms, the hesitation before simple conversations, and the quiet disappointment hidden behind forced smiles. Something was changing, but every attempt to bring them together seemed to arrive just a little too late. Even RM began noticing that the atmosphere surrounding the group no longer carried the effortless warmth it once had. Then everything changed on an ordinary afternoon that no one expected to remember. During what seemed like another exhausting day, Jimin suddenly lost his balance. His face turned pale, his breathing became uneven, and the strength that had carried him through endless performances disappeared within seconds. Before anyone fully understood what was happening, panic spread through the room. The members rushed toward him as fear replaced confusion, and within moments, sirens echoed through the streets while the hospital became their only destination. Doctors moved with urgent precision, but the expressions on their faces revealed far more than their carefully chosen words. The condition Jimin had hidden for weeks, perhaps even months, was far more serious than anyone had imagined. An emergency operation offered the best chance of survival, yet every passing minute narrowed that chance. The members pleaded silently for hope while waiting outside the operating room. Jin struggled to remain composed. J-Hope's optimism faded beneath visible worry. Sugar stood motionless, unable to hide the guilt of not noticing sooner. RM blamed himself for overlooking the signs hidden beneath Jimin's reassuring smiles. Taehyung stared toward the hospital entrance, as though expecting someone whose absence suddenly felt impossible to ignore. But the greatest shock came moments later. Despite his weakening condition, Jimin refused to sign the final consent for surgery. His trembling hands pushed away every attempt to persuade him, while his exhausted eyes remained fixed on the hallway leading toward the entrance. He was waiting for only one person. The problem was that Jungkook was hundreds of kilometers away, completely unaware that every second of delay was bringing Jimin closer to a decision that could change both of their lives forever. News of Jimin's sudden collapse spread through the members like a storm that left no room for clear thinking. Every phone call carried greater urgency than the last, every update from the doctors sounded more frightening, and every minute seemed to erase another fragment of hope. The hospital corridors, once filled only with hurried footsteps and distant machine alarms, became heavy with silent prayers and unspoken regret. Yet amid all the fear surrounding Jimin's condition, one question refused to disappear. Why was he risking his own life by refusing the operation that could save him? The medical team explained that delaying the surgery any longer could trigger irreversible complications. Jimin's body had already endured far more than anyone realized. His vital signs fluctuated unpredictably, forcing doctors to prepare for the worst while still hoping they could convince him to proceed. Every specialist who entered his room emerged carrying the same defeated expression. Nothing they said could change his decision. Outside the room, RM desperately tried to make sense of everything. As the leader, he had always believed he understood the emotional weight each member carried, yet he now felt as though an entire chapter of Jimin's suffering had unfolded beyond everyone's sight. Every memory from the previous months replayed inside his mind. The cancelled dinners, the quiet smiles that lasted a little too long, the moments Jimin insisted he was simply tired. Each memory transformed into another painful reminder that concern had been replaced by trust, and trust had unintentionally become blindness. Jin blamed himself for laughing away the moments when Jimin quietly rubbed his chest after long rehearsals. Sugar remembered several occasions when Jimin had stayed behind after practice, claiming he wanted to stretch longer while secretly struggling to regain his breath. J-Hope recalled countless mornings when Jimin looked exhausted before schedules had even begun. None of those moments had seemed alarming on their own, but together they formed a heartbreaking pattern that no one had recognized until it was almost too late. Taehyung remained unusually quiet. Unlike the others, his thoughts were focused less on the illness itself and more on the name Jimin had silently repeated before refusing surgery. He had seen the determination in Jimin's eyes. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, Jungkook was completely immersed in an important schedule that demanded his full attention. His phone remained buried beneath missed calls and unread messages while meetings, rehearsals, and travel delays kept him isolated from the growing crisis. He sensed an unexplained heaviness throughout the day, an unsettling feeling that refused to leave his heart, but he dismissed it as exhaustion. He had no way of knowing that every delayed notification was widening the distance between him and the person waiting most desperately for his arrival. The cruel timing was almost unbearable. Only a week earlier, Jungkook had chosen not to answer one of Jimin's late-night calls. It wasn't out of indifference or frustration. He had been standing at the edge of an opportunity that could determine the future of an important project, convinced that one missed conversation could easily be made up the following day. When he finally remembered to call back, Jimin had simply thanked him for checking in and assured him that everything was fine. The conversation ended quickly, leaving Jungkook with a strange sense of incompleteness that lingered longer than expected. What Jungkook never realized was that the call had not been ordinary. It had come immediately after Jimin received devastating medical results that changed everything. Instead of sharing his fear, Jimin chose silence. Instead of asking Jungkook to return, he encouraged him to focus on his responsibilities. He believed protecting Jungkook from guilt was the kindest decision he could make. The diagnosis became a burden he carried alone, convincing himself there would always be another chance to explain once everyone was free from overwhelming responsibilities. But fate had rewritten those plans. Back at the hospital, another alarming change appeared in Jimin's condition. The monitors surrounding his bed became increasingly unstable, forcing doctors to prepare emergency alternatives if his body could no longer endure the delay. Nurses exchanged worried glances while specialists quietly reviewed contingency plans. Even without hearing every medical term, the members understood one terrifying truth. Time was slipping away faster than anyone had imagined. Still, Jimin never looked toward the operating room doors. His eyes remained fixed on the hallway. As though every heartbeat depended not on medicine, but on the arrival of the one person he believed needed to hear something before it was forever too late. None of the members understood what that hidden truth could possibly be. And somewhere far beyond the hospital walls, Jungkook's phone finally began to ring once more, this time with a call that would shatter everything he believed about the distance that had quietly grown between them. Jungkook hesitated only for the briefest moment before answering, but that single heartbeat became a dividing line between the life he thought he was living and the reality that had been unfolding without him. The voice on the other end spoke with an urgency that needed no explanation. Before every detail had even been revealed, dread settled heavily inside his chest. The words that followed struck harder than anything he had ever imagined. Jimin had collapsed. His condition was critical. The doctors were prepared to operate immediately. But Jimin had refused to let anyone begin. The world around Jungkook seemed to lose all sound. The crowded terminal, the announcements echoing through the building, the hurried footsteps of strangers, and the conversation surrounding him all faded into meaningless noise. Only one thought remained clear enough to hear. Jimin was waiting for him. Without another second of hesitation, Jungkook abandoned everything that had seemed important only moments before. Meetings were forgotten. Deadlines became meaningless. Every professional obligation that had consumed his attention for weeks instantly dissolved beneath the terrifying possibility that he might never see Jimin again. For the first time in months, he realized how fragile every postponed conversation truly was. Yet leaving proved far more difficult than deciding to go. A violent thunderstorm had swept across the region, grounding flights and delaying transportation throughout the night. Airport departure boards filled with flashing warnings, and anxious travelers crowded every counter searching for alternatives. Jungkook moved from one gate to another, desperately searching for any route that could bring him closer to the hospital. Every delay felt like another piece of Jimin's remaining time slipping away beyond his reach. As frustration mounted, memories he had tried to ignore began returning with painful clarity. He remembered Jimin quietly rubbing his shoulder after long rehearsals before insisting he was only tired. He remembered offering to accompany him to a medical appointment, only for Jimin to gently refuse with reassuring confidence. He remembered the subtle weight hidden behind Jimin's smile during recent meals, a smile that looked genuine until he replayed it now through the unbearable lens of regret. Each memory became another accusation against himself. He had believed giving Jimin space was an act of respect. He had convinced himself that trust meant allowing the other person to carry their own burdens. Now that same belief felt painfully incomplete. Trust without presence had left room for silence, and silence had become the perfect place for suffering to hide. Back at the hospital, the atmosphere grew increasingly desperate. Doctors made one final appeal, explaining that the operation's chances of success were falling with every passing minute. The medical team had reached the point where waiting any longer could make even a successful surgery incapable of reversing the damage already spreading through Jimin's body. Their expressions remained calm, but their eyes betrayed the urgency they could no longer conceal. RM stood beside the consultation room, feeling the crushing responsibility of leadership without the power to change what mattered most. The sight before him nearly stopped him in his tracks. Jimin looked weaker than anyone had ever seen him. The warmth that usually brightened every room had been replaced by exhaustion that even determination could no longer disguise. Yet despite his fading strength, his gaze remained fixed toward the doorway with unwavering certainty. He wasn't looking at the medical equipment surrounding him. He wasn't searching for reassurance from the doctors. He was waiting for someone whose arrival carried greater meaning than his own fear of death. Watching that quiet determination, Taehyung began remembering something that had happened months earlier. At the time, Taehyung believed Jimin was simply trying to protect someone he deeply cared about. Now that memory carried an entirely different meaning. It suggested that Jimin's refusal to undergo surgery had never been driven by fear of the procedure itself. Instead, it seemed connected to a promise, a secret, or a burden that had remained hidden from everyone else. As another emergency update echoed through the hospital corridors, Taehyung realized the truth might be far more heartbreaking than any of them had imagined. And just as Jungkook finally found a desperate way to continue his journey through the storm, a nurse rushed from Jimin's room with an expression that caused every member's heart to sink. Jimin's condition had taken another sudden turn, and the doctors warned that there might not be much time left before the choice was no longer his to make. A wave of controlled urgency swept through the intensive care unit as specialists gathered once again outside Jimin's room. Medical charts changed hands in silence, monitors emitted increasingly erratic rhythms, and every member standing in the hallway instinctively looked toward the closed door, hoping it would somehow open with better news. Instead, another physician emerged with the same restrained expression that had become painfully familiar. Jimin's body was losing the strength to keep waiting. The words settled over everyone like a weight that no one could lift. RM stepped aside and leaned against the cold hospital wall, feeling the crushing helplessness that leadership could not overcome. Throughout the years he had guided the group through endless challenges, believing that unity could solve almost anything. But this was different. No amount of encouragement, planning, or determination could persuade Jimin to abandon the one decision he refused to change. Jin quietly walked toward the hospital chapel, searching for a moment of peace that never came. Sugar remained seated with his eyes fixed on the floor, replaying every recent memory until each one became another unanswered question. J-Hope continued trying to reassure everyone else, but the optimism that usually defined him was beginning to crack beneath the unbearable uncertainty. Taehyung alone seemed caught between fear and realization, as if invisible pieces of a forgotten puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. Inside the room, Jimin's strength continued to fade. His breathing had become noticeably more labored, and the exhaustion written across his face made it impossible to hide how much pain he was enduring. Yet there was something remarkably calm about him. It was not the calm of surrender, nor the calm of someone who had given up hope. It was the quiet determination of someone carrying a responsibility that mattered more than his own survival. The doctors struggled to understand it. Every medical explanation ended the same way. Every appeal was met with the same unwavering resolve. Even as his condition deteriorated, Jimin never asked for more time for himself. Instead, his eyes continued drifting toward the entrance, measuring every passing second against the hope that Jungkook would arrive before fate made the decision for him. Far away, Jungkook's desperate journey grew even more difficult. With commercial flights suspended because of the worsening storm, he managed to secure ground transportation that would cut through the night despite flooded roads and dangerous conditions. Rain pounded relentlessly against the windows, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Every traffic delay tightened the pressure inside his chest. Every passing kilometer felt impossibly slow. For the first time in years, Jungkook allowed himself to confront memories he had buried beneath endless work. He remembered how Jimin had gradually stopped asking him to stay after rehearsals. He remembered birthdays celebrated with smiles that now seemed strangely restrained. He remembered countless opportunities to ask deeper questions, each one postponed because there would always be another day. Now that assumption haunted him. He began realizing that love was not only measured by sacrifices willingly made. Sometimes it was measured by the conversations people believed could safely wait until tomorrow. The rain outside intensified as though reflecting the chaos inside his mind. Then another memory surfaced. Several months earlier, Jimin had unexpectedly handed Jungkook a small sealed envelope, asking him to keep it safe without opening it unless something happened that could never be undone. Jungkook had laughed softly at the unusual request, assuming it reflected Jimin's sentimental nature, and stored the envelope among his personal belongings without another thought. He had completely forgotten about it. Now, as panic consumed him, the memory returned with terrifying clarity. What if that envelope contained the explanation for everything? What if Jimin had known far longer than anyone imagined? Back at the hospital, Taehyung experienced a similar realization. Searching through the personal items that had accompanied Jimin to the hospital, he discovered a neatly folded notebook hidden beneath a jacket. He did not immediately open it, but one sentence written across the cover froze him in place. It was addressed not to the doctors, not to the members, only to Jungkook. Taehyung's hands trembled as he stared at the notebook, understanding that whatever was written inside could explain why Jimin had refused surgery despite standing at the edge of life itself. But opening something clearly meant for Jungkook felt like violating the final piece of trust Jimin still held. He quietly placed the notebook back where he had found it. If Jimin had fought this hard to wait, then there had to be a reason powerful enough to justify risking everything. Moments later, another alarm echoed from inside Jimin's room. Doctors rushed past the members without hesitation. Nurses followed with emergency equipment. The atmosphere instantly shifted from anxious waiting to immediate crisis. No one spoke. No one moved. Every heartbeat in the hallway seemed to stop as the medical team fought to stabilize Jimin once more. And just then, after battling storms, delays, and impossible distance, Jungkook's vehicle finally turned onto the road leading toward the hospital. He was only minutes away. But inside the operating room preparation area, the doctors were no longer certain Jimin had minutes left to wait. The emergency alarms gradually subsided, but the silence that followed felt even more terrifying. Doctors managed to stabilize Jimin for the moment, though only by the narrowest margin. Their relief was brief. The lead surgeon gathered the members once again and explained that Jimin's body had reached its absolute limit. Every minute of delay now carried consequences that might never be reversed, even if the operation eventually succeeded. Hope still existed, but it was slipping away faster than anyone wanted to admit. The hallway became unbearably still. RM closed his eyes, silently pleading for time. Jin sat motionless with his hands clasped together, unable to hide the tears gathering in his eyes. Sugar stared toward the operating room doors as though refusing to look away might somehow keep Jimin safe. J-Hope's restless pacing finally stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that reflected the fear everyone shared. Taehyung remained near Jimin's room, his thoughts fixed on the notebook hidden among Jimin's belongings. Something inside him whispered that the notebook held the answer to everything. Yet another part of him refused to betray the trust Jimin had placed in Jungkook. Instead of opening it, Taehyung made a different decision. He carried the notebook with him, determined that if Jungkook arrived in time, it would be placed directly into his hands. Whatever truth Jimin had protected for so long deserved to be revealed exactly as he intended. Outside, the relentless rain finally began to weaken. Jungkook's vehicle sped through the final streets leading to the hospital, every red light feeling like an unbearable obstacle. His breathing had become uneven, not from exhaustion but from the crushing fear that he might already be too late. Countless scenarios raced through his mind, each one more heartbreaking than the last. He imagined arriving to an empty room. He imagined never hearing Jimin's laugh again. He imagined living with the unbearable weight of every postponed conversation for the rest of his life. Then another memory surfaced. Months earlier, after a particularly exhausting rehearsal, Jimin had quietly watched Jungkook leave before whispering something so softly that it was almost lost beneath the surrounding noise. Jungkook had turned back only briefly, catching nothing more than a gentle smile before continuing on his way. He never learned what Jimin had wanted to say. Now that forgotten moment returned with painful force. What if those unspoken words had mattered more than either of them realized? At the hospital entrance, headlights finally cut through the darkness. The vehicle came to a sudden stop. Before it had fully halted, Jungkook was already running. Rain soaked his clothes as he rushed through the sliding doors, barely noticing the startled faces around him. His footsteps echoed through the lobby, then along the endless corridors where every second felt impossibly precious. Staff members pointed him toward the intensive care unit, recognizing immediately why desperation had replaced every trace of composure on his face. The members looked up almost simultaneously. For a brief moment, relief and heartbreak collided. Jungkook had made it. But the expressions waiting for him revealed that his arrival had not ended the nightmare. RM stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on Jungkook's shoulder before silently leading him toward Jimin's room. No explanations were necessary anymore. Everything that needed to be understood could already be seen in the exhausted faces surrounding him. Just before reaching the door, Taehyung stopped Jungkook. Without saying a word, he carefully placed the worn notebook into Jungkook's hands. The cover bore only a few handwritten words. For Jungkook. Nothing else. Jungkook's hands began to tremble. He looked from the notebook to the door beyond it, realizing that whatever waited inside those pages might explain every unanswered question, every hidden smile, every unexplained absence, and every reason Jimin had refused the operation. But opening the notebook now would cost precious time. Walking into Jimin's room first meant continuing without knowing the truth that Jimin had protected until the very end. Standing frozen between the notebook and the hospital door, Jungkook faced the most impossible decision of his life. And on the other side of that door, Jimin's weakening heartbeat continued to echo through the monitors, as though it, too, was waiting for Jungkook's next step before deciding whether to keep fighting. Jungkook stood motionless for only a fraction of a second, but to everyone watching, that moment seemed to stretch into an eternity. The notebook in his trembling hands felt impossibly heavy, as though every unanswered question from the past several months had been bound within its worn cover. Behind the hospital door lay Jimin, clinging to consciousness with every remaining ounce of strength. Inside the notebook waited the truth Jimin had guarded even while standing at the edge of life. His heart made the decision before his mind could. Jungkook tightened his grip on the notebook without opening it and pushed the door open. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of medical equipment struggling to keep pace with Jimin's weakening body. Soft lights illuminated the pale expression that had replaced the warmth everyone knew so well. Tubes, monitors, and carefully arranged medical devices surrounded the bed, but none of them drew Jungkook's attention for more than an instant. His eyes found only Jimin. For the first time since entering the hospital, the overwhelming panic inside him gave way to something even more painful. Regret. Not the regret of arriving late. Not the regret of missing phone calls. It was the regret of believing there would always be another tomorrow. The doctors noticed a subtle change the moment Jungkook stepped closer. Jimin's restless breathing, which had remained uneven despite every effort to stabilize him, gradually became calmer. His tightly clenched hands slowly relaxed. Even the tension that had remained visible across his exhausted face began to soften, as though the simple certainty that Jungkook had finally arrived eased a burden no medicine had been able to reach. The lead surgeon exchanged a brief glance with the medical team. None of them spoke. Some things could not be explained through science alone. Outside the room, the members watched through the observation window, barely daring to breathe. RM lowered his head in quiet relief. Jin pressed a hand over his mouth as tears finally escaped. J-Hope whispered a silent prayer. Sugar closed his eyes, while Taehyung held the notebook's empty protective sleeve, silently hoping that the moment Jimin had fought so desperately to reach had finally arrived. Inside, Jungkook carefully sat beside the bed. Only then did he look down at the notebook once more. His fingers hesitated over the cover before finally opening the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably Jimin's. The opening lines were simple, yet they shattered everything Jungkook believed he understood. Jimin revealed that he had learned about his serious condition months earlier. The illness had progressed quietly, giving him time to seek treatment, but also forcing him to make impossible choices. During that time, he had watched Jungkook sacrifice sleep, health, and peace of mind while carrying enormous responsibilities for everyone around him. Every time Jimin wanted to reveal the diagnosis, he saw another burden already resting on Jungkook's shoulders. So he chose silence. Not because he doubted Jungkook's love. Because he trusted it too much. He feared that if Jungkook knew the truth, he would abandon every responsibility without hesitation. Jimin could not bear the thought of becoming the reason Jungkook gave up the future he had worked so hard to build. Page after page unfolded with quiet honesty. Jimin described pretending to feel stronger than he really was. He admitted smiling through pain that grew worse every week. He confessed that every cancelled dinner, every shortened conversation, and every reassuring message had been carefully crafted to protect Jungkook from carrying yet another burden. Then came the sentence that stopped Jungkook's breathing. Jimin wrote that he had refused surgery for only one reason. He was terrified that if the operation failed before seeing Jungkook one last time, the final memory between them would forever remain a missed phone call and unfinished words. He could accept losing his own future. He could not accept leaving Jungkook with a lifetime of unanswered questions. Tears blurred Jungkook's vision until the words became almost impossible to read. Every misunderstanding that had quietly separated them suddenly collapsed beneath the overwhelming truth. There had never been rejection. There had never been emotional distance. Only two people desperately trying to protect each other, and unintentionally causing the deepest pain either had ever experienced. Jungkook slowly closed the notebook and looked back at Jimin, whose eyes had begun to open with great effort. Their gazes finally met. No explanations were needed anymore. Everything that had remained hidden for months now existed silently between them. Outside, the lead surgeon stepped forward, gently reminding everyone that there was no more time left to wait. The operation had to begin immediately. As nurses carefully prepared to move Jimin toward the operating theater, Jungkook remained at his side, refusing to let go even for a moment. and for the first time since the nightmare began, Jimin offered the faintest, most peaceful smile, one that seemed to say his heart had finally found what it had been waiting for before, entrusting the rest to fate. The doors to the operating theatre opened with solemn precision, and the medical team moved with a calm urgency that came only from years of confronting impossible moments. Jimin's bed rolled slowly down the brightly lit corridor, surrounded by surgeons, nurses, and specialists who understood that the next several hours would determine far more than the outcome of a complicated procedure. Jungkook never released Jimin's hand. He walked beside the moving bed until the hospital staff gently signaled that he could go no farther. Even then, his fingers lingered for one final moment, unwilling to let go of the connection that Jimin had fought so desperately to preserve. As their hands finally separated, an overwhelming wave of guilt swept through him, not because he believed he had failed Jimin intentionally, but because he finally understood how deeply silence could wound two people who loved each other beyond words. The operating room doors closed. Everything became still. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. RM quietly guided everyone back toward the waiting area, where exhaustion and hope settled together in uneasy silence. Hours stretched endlessly. The rain outside had stopped, but dawn had not yet broken, leaving the hospital suspended in a grey stillness that mirrored the uncertainty inside every heart. Jungkook remained seated with Jimin's notebook resting in his hands. This time, he continued reading. The later pages were not filled with fear or despair. Instead, they revealed the depth of Jimin's faith in the people around him. Then Jungkook reached the final page. There, Jimin admitted one last truth. He had never intended for the notebook to become a well. He believed, perhaps stubbornly, perhaps hopefully, that Jungkook would arrive before the surgery. He believed they would still have another chapter after everything was over. The notebook was never meant to end their story. It was meant to remove every wall that silence had built between them, allowing whatever future remained to begin without regret. Jungkook closed the notebook against his chest. For the first time since entering the hospital, tears no longer came from despair alone. They came from hope. Hours later, the silence outside the operating room finally broke. The doors slowly opened. Every member rose to their feet at once. The lead surgeon stepped into the hallway, exhaustion visible across every feature. For a long moment, no one could read the expression on the doctor's face, and that uncertainty felt almost unbearable. Then came the words they had all been waiting to hear. The surgery had been successful. Jungkook stood frozen. His legs nearly gave way beneath him as months of fear, guilt, exhaustion, and love finally crashed together all at once. Jimin still faced a long recovery. There would be difficult days ahead. There would be rehabilitation, lingering pain, and emotional wounds that could not disappear overnight. But there would also be tomorrow. When Jimin was finally moved into recovery, Jungkook sat quietly beside the bed once again. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the hospital window, replacing the harsh darkness that had surrounded them only hours earlier. Machines still monitored every heartbeat, but the atmosphere had changed completely. It no longer felt like a room preparing to say goodbye. It felt like the beginning of another chance. Over the following weeks, healing came slowly. The members visited every day, filling the room with gentle laughter, familiar routines, and the comforting presence that had always defined them as a family. RM reminded everyone that strength also meant allowing others to carry part of the burden. Jin made sure no one skipped meals. Sugar stayed quietly nearby whenever words weren't enough. J-Hope brought warmth back into every room he entered. Taehyung often looked toward Jungkook and Jimin with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the silence which had nearly destroyed them had finally been replaced by understanding. Jungkook changed as well. He no longer assumed there would always be another opportunity to ask how someone was truly feeling. He learned that love required more than trust. It required presence, honesty, and the courage to face painful truths together instead of alone. And Jimin, though still recovering, carried a lighter heart than he had in months. The secret that had once isolated him was gone. The fear that Jungkook would blame himself forever had disappeared. What remained was a bond strengthened not because it had avoided hardship, but because it had survived it. Long after the hospital became only a memory, the notebook stayed safely with Jungkook. Not as a reminder of the night they almost lost everything, but as a reminder that the deepest love is never proven by suffering in silence. It is proven by allowing those who care about us to stand beside us, even in our weakest moments. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is not protecting someone from the truth. Sometimes it is trusting them enough to carry that truth with you. And perhaps that is why Jimin waited. Not because he feared the surgery, but because he refused to let the final chapter of their story be written by silence when it deserved to be written by hope instead.